Welcome back, Mr. Schulte here with another screencast. Today we're looking at Chapter 6, Section 2, The Age of Railroads. As always, before we get going, let's take a look at the things that we want to be able to identify by the time we're done with this screencast. First up, we're looking to identify the role of the railroads in unifying the nation. Next, we'll try to list some of the positives and negative effects that railroads are going to have on the nation's economy. And finally, we're going to look at and summarize the reasons for and the outcomes of these demands to regulate the railroad. So when people are struggling with the railroads like they did in Chapter 5, what did they do about it? And then how successful were their efforts? Let's take a look at railroad expansion in the 1800s and really take a moment to look at this map. And you might notice something a little bit different about the ones out west. If you look at the key, you see they're highlighted in orange, and that indicates that the federal government is providing land to these railroads. And so the railroads are definitely benefiting by the government giving them land. And so the government is encouraging this railroad growth because the government thinks railroads are going to be beneficial to the country. The most famous of these railroads comes up next with the Transcontinental Railroad. Now this is going to be completed in 1869. We talked about this briefly in Chapter 5, Section 2, but we're going to touch a little bit more on it right now. Before we get into that, I want you to take a look at this map. And here's where our first question is going to come up for this screencast. You can see the Union Pacific going from the east to the west and the Central Pacific going from the west to the east. Take a moment and I want you to think about why was the Union Pacific in blue able to lay down more track than the Central Pacific in red? Your hint, geography. Alright, with that question finished up, let's take a look at the Transcontinental Railroad. Workforce is something that was mentioned in our last chapter, and so let's touch on that again. We have the workforce making the Transcontinental Railroad being Civil War veterans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, the Irish, which are mainly going to be working for the Union Pacific, and then the Central Pacific is going to have almost 90% of its workforce is going to be Chinese. And here's where we see some discrimination starting to come about. These Chinese people came to America for the gold rush, they stayed, they stuck around, and now they're getting an opportunity to work for the railroads. But there is going to be quite a bit of discrimination. Wages for Chinese workers are going to be almost half that of white people, and at the same time, Chinese workers are going to have to supply their own food, which was included in the wage and salary of other white workers. Building the railroads is a dangerous job. By the time it was done, you have over 20,000 people are injured on the job, and 2,000 of those people are going to be killed. Most of those will be from the Central Pacific as they are blasting through rocks in the west. East meets west here at Promontory Point, Utah. This is the same picture we have hanging above the door in the classroom. And you can see the Union Pacific and Central Pacific having a little party and a photograph to document this momentous occasion. As the railroad is complete, we have connected the East and West. Let's see what that's going to do for the United States. One of the first positives that comes out of the completion of the railroads and transcontinental railroads is now time zones. As people are moving transcontinental, so from one side of the country to the other, there needs to be standardized time. Can you imagine if you showed up to the rail station half hour early only to find you'd missed your train because it came an hour before? And so railroad workers and people who traveled on the railroads found this out pretty quickly on with transcontinental trade, that they needed to have synchronized time zones. And although the federal government won't adopt these time zones into the 1900s, people that work for the railroads had centralized time, and they had standard time that everyone had their watch sets to, so they knew when they could expect the next shipment and when it would be then leaving as well. Railroads are going to be good for the country in many ways, and so stay with me on this one here. Railroads equal growth. As more railroads are being constructed and built out west, you have towns popping up along the railroads. We know in Chapter 5, talking about homesteaders and people are moving out west, the railroad is going to be their hub to get supplies and also to get information. And so more and more people will start to move out west, and towns will spring up along these railroad lines because that's where all the supplies are going to come from. The more towns you have coming out west, the more markets there are going to be nationally. And markets equal industry boom. And so out east is where the factories are going to be. And they're going to be producing stuff for those people who are living out west. They always say a good indicator of predicting how well a nation's economy is housing starts. So how many new houses are being built? And if you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If you're building a new house and a family moves into it, think of all the stuff that goes into that house. And maybe as our example, why don't you think of your bedroom? Pause the video here and just think about all of the items you have in your room. All of those items you have in your room had to be bought and paid for, right? They had to be made somewhere. Now, at this time in the 1800s, most of those products are going to be made in America. We saw in section 1, as new technology is advancing and factories are popping up in the East, America is like the perfect place for this industrial growth to take place. We have the natural resources. We now have a population increase. We'll talk about more immigrants coming over here in chapter 7 as well. And so America is set for this industrial boom, and these markets out west are going to then facilitate that because Americans have people that are willing to buy their product. Take a moment here to answer our next question, looking to list 3 positives or benefits that happened to the United States based off of railroad growth. Our next class period, we're going to take a look at corruption and greed of the railroads, and our 2 examples that we're going to spend our time on will be the story of George Pullman and his company town in Pullman, Illinois, and then also the story of the Credit Mobilier. This is going to be a railroad construction company, and find how these 2 examples are going to highlight the greed, the corruption, the inefficiency that exists within railroads in the United States. Now, some of the railroad abuses that we're already familiar with are land being taken up by railroads and other businesses. The Homestead Act, as we learned in chapter 5, was designated to give land to white settlers so they could live in the West. And much of this got gobbled up by companies, including the railroads. And so there's already the fact that they kind of stole land from the American people. And on top of that, we have this idea of price fixing, which farmers saw at the end of the late 1800s. Looking at our political cartoon, the gentleman standing with the pitchfork represents the Populist Party, or the Grange as it says on his hat, and he's trying to warn these farmers to wake up. The railroads are coming. And if you look closely at the railroad cars, you'll see a couple things written there. The first one is the consolidation of trains, and so different rail lines will then consolidate together to form monopolies, and we'll talk more about that later on. There's corruption, as we'll see an example of the Credit Mobilier. There's bribery that also ties in with the Credit Mobilier, and there's this idea of usurpation, that these railroads are so powerful that they can get away with murder and they can charge whatever they want to. And that's what the farmers are facing, and that's really why the Grange got created. And we can see that illustrated here with this next political cartoon as well. The large gentleman in the middle is William Vanderbilt. On the left we have Cyrus Fields, and on the right we have Jay Gould. These 3 individuals merged together to form one large railroad company, and as you can see, they're the puppet masters. They're the ones pulling all the strings, and if you wanted to travel on the railroad, well, you needed to answer to these guys. And so it seems like railroads have almost unlimited power at this time. With the Populist Party, really started out of that grassroots organization known as the Grange, and so after years and years of the average person kind of fighting to try to regulate the railroad, there are going to be a series of laws passed known as the Granger Laws, are going to set maximum freight rate, passenger rates, and also prohibit discrimination. And what that means is they're going to try to prevent railroad companies from charging different people, like farmers, different prices to ship their product from point A to point V, where they might not charge that same price to another company. The Granger Laws are going to be challenged in a court case that will go all the way up to the Supreme Court, known as Munn versus Illinois. For our final question, what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at the majority opinion here of Munn versus Illinois. Read through it, and I want you to summarize what the outcome is. What are the restrictions? What's illegal? What's not legal now based off of Munn versus Illinois as we try to then regulate the railroads? And the final act we'll look at today is the Interstate Commerce Act. This is going to be passed in 1886, and it says it gives the federal government the right to regulate the railroads. So we're building off of Munn versus Illinois, where the states had the right to regulate the railroads, and now we're saying that the federal government has the right to regulate railroads as it's interstate commerce. Moving from one state to the next, the federal government says it has the ability to regulate trade from state to state. In 1887, they set up the Interstate Commerce Commission, and so they put a 5-man commission together that's supposed to look after all of these railroads. Now, unfortunately, for the average person, and really the government as they tried to enact these laws, none of these are going to be overly successful in limiting the railroads. The reason being, railroads are very powerful. They have lots of money. They have influence in Congress, and for the next decade or so, they're going to be able to skirt these laws and continue on as if nothing happened. And we won't really see major change until Teddy Roosevelt and the Progressive Era. Our final cartoon is going to deal with that same issue. We've seen this one before. It's called Bosses of the Senate. The people who are controlling the Senate are standing in the back, and that's the entrance for monopolies. Railroads are going to be in this same category. Large individuals, large companies with lots of money and influence that can then buy off senators and politicians, as we saw with the Credmobiler scandal, and continue kind of doing what they want. With that, we'll end this screencast. I want you to think about the things you've heard here, and if you have any questions, I want you to write them down, and I want you to come to class with those for our next class period, and we'll dive right in and kind of clear up any confusion you might have. Thanks for listening.